Very good evening, friends. Meeting again in the session of Stuart Close Philosophy, and we're discussing since long time the chapter of susceptibility, the reaction, and the immunity, where Stuart Close tried his level best to explain these concepts clearly. He started with the definition of the susceptibility, and in his own manner, he has explained the susceptibility where he explains the susceptibility as a inherent capacity of every living things to receive the impression and react to that. And this specific reaction itself, it reflects as the reaction of that human being. And then he started explaining about the factors modifying the susceptibility. Then he explained about the mm, consideration that this susceptibility can be increased, can be decreased, can be destroyed. So susceptibility either it remains normal, it can be increased, it can be decreased and destroyed. And then he has given one example that how these allopathic medicines or seras, those disturb the susceptibility of human being. In modern era, there are many seras which are used, vaccines which are used, and these are the things which reflects along and produces disharmony, producing disturbed susceptibility of human being. And these things are quite common with the those medicines as well as those serums or vaccines. The last example which he has mentioned about the tonsillitis, that if antibiotics or antiseptics are used to treat the tonsillitis, how it prolongs the convulsions, the recovery period, because of use of antitoxins and because of production of endotoxins. And many times he has explained that after giving the seras, after giving the anti-seras, the bacteria gets killed, but because as the bacteria gets killed, the immediately the endotoxins which produces ultimately ends with the life of the human being, and there is a no use of giving those things. That's what we were discussing in last lecture. We were on page number 81. The last paragraph with which we have to start. The destructive action of antiseptics upon living tissue cells and phagocytic leukocytes of the host. Otherwise, the patient was also pointed out as contraindicating their use by these discerning authority. In destroying these bodies, we are destroying the physical basis of life itself. We slay our best friends. They further showed that the depression of vitality thus caused resulted later in the increase of fever and cervical adenitis due to the increased absorption of toxins. What they failed to see and explain, however, was that the increased fever and inflammation were in reality the manifestations of vital reactions or resistance on the part of the organism, which is the means by which real natural curative antibodies and antitoxins are produced. And that is that this should never be interfered with. So he was explaining about the antiseptics or antibiotics and how it fails, the reasons behind that. Generally, what happens whenever you treat such types of disorders with the antipyretics, anti-inflammatory antibiotics, the natural reaction of vital force you disturbs because of such a thing. And when such thing happens, and if you try to kill the bacteria with the help of antiserums or antiseptic, the there is a big production of endotoxins, and those endotoxins disturbs the human life. So if we never allow ourselves to react by our own immune system, by our own vital reaction, we lose our susceptibility. Our susceptibility gets hampered, and once it gets hampered, we are prone to succumb to many types of such types of infection. So, using antibiotic, using an anti-inflammatory is not an answer every time. That's why he says again, inflammation and fever are not evils per se. Very important sentence. In fact, they are the fighting agents. They are merely the signs of normal reaction and resistance to an irritant or poison by which nature protects herself. They are not enemies to be resisted, but friends and allies to be cooperated with the destruction of common enemy. So, in a very simple, lucid language, he says that inflammation and fever, they are not the disease itself, they are in fact the fighting agents, because of which you are protected. But we are removing the inflammation, we are removing the fever. Inflammation and fever means simply greater vital reactivity, more rapid circulation, respiration, and oxygenation, more rapid and thorough elimination of waste and toxic substances, and the concurrent formation and natural antitoxins and antibodies by means of which recovery is brought about. So, this is the method with which we are fighting against our enemies. And this is a simple reaction given by our immune system, our vital force. If it happens, let it happen. Help the reaction so that the enemy will get killed very easily. Pain and inflammation and fever. Pain, inflammation, and fever are not the real disease nor the real object of treatment. To view them as such leads logically and inevitably to mere palliation or suppression of symptoms than which are no greater medical evil. It is based upon false and illogical interpretation of the phenomena of disease, which mistakes results for causes. So, if we give antibiotics, antipyretics, anti-inflammatory, we prolong the illness. The things which can get very easily covered with the help of proper homeopathic remedy, the same disease gets prolonged under the action of allopathic medicine. Most common example, recent example is chikungunya fever. Those who are treated with antibiotics, anti-inflammatory, then steroids, and they are suffering for months together with the help of such types of medicine. But if you treat same chikungunya with the help of homeopathy, finding it out right simillimum for the case, the patient's case can be solved within span of 4 5 days, and there will be no more recurrence, which happens to be there very easily with after the anti-inflammatory and steroids. So here he tries to explain that how susceptibility gets hampered because of use of such drugs, and that's what one must know. And now he turns towards one more point: stimulants and depressants. What is the action of stimulants and depressants on human being? Professor James C. Wood, veteran surgeon and author of Cleveland, Ohio, in a letter to a writer dated February 20, 1922, following the publication of this article in the Homeopathic Recorder, wrote as follows: there is one remedy you have omitted in your discussion of shock, namely the strychnia or noxomega. Who has written this? This has been written by a surgeon. Kreil, in his experimental work on shock, has shown that it is almost impossible to differentiate true shock from strychnia poisoning. As a result of this experimentation, surgeons have pretty largely discarded strychnia in the treatment of shock, Kreil proving that they are killing more than they are curing by full doses of strychnia in dealing with the same. On the other hand, I am using it in small doses with the greatest possible advantage, showing conclusively, I think, its homeopathicity in shock. So who has written this? This has been written by a surgeon, and he is explaining that strychnine works beautifully in cases of shock. And this is truth. But in what way? Not giving in large doses, but giving in infinitesimal doses. If you apply the law of similars, and if you apply the properly potentized medicine, it works beautifully. It seems to be pretty well established that alcohol, the typical and perhaps most commonly used stimulant, adds nothing to the physiological forces of the body. It takes of what might be called the reserve fund of organic force and uses it up a little faster than nature would otherwise permit. It acts like a whip to the tired horse, not like rest, water, and food, which nourish, strengthen, repair, and replace worn out tissue. Its action on the brain and nerves is well known. Many have seen on dissecting table the characteristic watery, contracted brain of the chronic alcoholic. We know the power of alcohol to harden and shrivel and devitalize organic tissue. Its power to paralyze the vasomotor system is seen in the flushed face, congested capillaries, and ruby nodes of the inebriate. We are aware of its inhibiting effect upon the sensory nerves, by which it makes its victim insensible to the impressions of the heat, cold, and pain. So that in extreme intoxication he falls on the red hot stove and is burned to death, or staggers into a snow bank and freezes to death without knowing it. All these things define the nature and measure of power of alcohol to decrease and destroy the normal susceptibility. So alcohol, you have seen many examples of alcoholism. There are many effects, those who consume alcohol in larger quantities. What happens with them? Why do they take the alcohol? They take it as a stimulant. But the same alcohol, after some time, depresses the susceptibility, hampers the susceptibility, and person becomes more and more dull, sluggish. The systems becomes dull. They starts they they starts getting destroyed. Liver gets destroyed because it gets metabolized over there, and liver cell starts getting destroyed over there. Sometimes there is fatty degeneration which starts. And because of all those things, in material doses, when alcohol used or they are using as a stimulant, ultimately hampers the susceptibility or destroys the susceptibility. So stimulants never increases the susceptibility, but generally afterwards they produce to decrease or destroy the normal susceptibility of the human being. Less only in proportion to the amount used in its influence to lessen susceptibility when used in as a stimulant in disease. Here, as in another realms, the law holds good. The action and reactions are equal and opposite. Stimulation and depression are equal and opposite. With the exhausted horse, he will go on little ways and then drops. No amount of whipping will start him up again. He soon reaches a point where his susceptibility to that kind of stimulant is exhausted. Overstimulate the weakened and exhausted patient, and same thing will happen. So he has given very simple example of a horse. If you use whip and tries to run him with faster speed, temporarily it can happen, but afterwards, when his strength loses, he will fall down and there will be no further reaction, or there will be no further change, there will be no further movement from that horse. The same thing happens when you use the stimulants. Stimulants works temporarily. Temporarily they give stimulants your physique, but it never remains permanent and you fall down. It is same action which happens over there. This is not to say that there is no place for physiological drug stimulants in healing art, but only to a point out that the place which they legitimately feel is an exceedingly small one and rarely made. Certain rare cases of typhoid fever, diphtheria, perhaps a few other similar conditions may be benefited by very small doses of pure brandy and tided over crisis by that means when they might otherwise die. But the amount of stimulant necessary to accomplish that end is extremely small. Generally, this happens, or this type of need is there in the countries where there is a tremendous cold. The environment is cold, body is cold, and to stimulate very small dose of brandy they used to give, and that in order to increase the heat inside the body. This habit is there in cold environment where there is a minus temperature. But we lose our intelligence and we follow them directly as it is without using intellect, that why they are taking the brandy and why it was needed for them and how it is harmful for us. So this is what happens. More than the necessary amount will assuredly hasten the death, because the margin of strength is so small, the least waste by overuse may prove fatal. So, if it has been used in larger quantities, ultimately it destroys the susceptibility and weakens the person. The proper use of stimulants in the type of cases referred to was once illustrated by Dr. P. Wells. In a critical case of the typhoid fever, which he saw in consultation, the patient had suffered a severe hemorrhage from the bowels, was very weak pulse, nearly unconscious, and had a soft compressible pulse. Dr. Wells directed that 6 drops of brandy be put into 6 teaspoonful of milk and the whole given in 3 doses of 2 teaspoonful each at an intervals of 2 hours to be repeated if reaction did not follow. The effect was surprising. Reaction quickly followed and patient made a rapid recovery. So see how much small amount of thing worked out over there. But what he says further, we may smile at the size of the dose until we recall how many patients in a similar condition have died under the tablespoonful doses of brandy and hypodermics of strychnine and whiskey. Dr. Wells knew how to correctly measure a patient's susceptibility, and he knew how to conserve the last feeble flickering remnant of the vitality in such cases and make the best of it. He knew better than to waste it by violent measures, as is so often done in cases of shock when hypodermics of brandy and strychnine and other powerful stimulants are used. So this is quite common that if the things which are given in larger quantity hampers the cells or hampers the vitality. But if it has been used in a proper doses required depending on the susceptibility, they works beautifully to recover from that state. The idea held by many that large and powerful doses and strenuous measures are necessary in such cases is entirely wrong. That was the thought in materialistic mind. If we give more dose, it will work fast. This is wrong concept. The conception of disease and the interpretation of symptoms is wrong. The resultant treatment is wrong. The imaginary idea of violence, of the malignity, and rapidity of the disease is forced to the front and dwelt upon until it seems rational to believe that treatment must also be violent, active, and heroic. This is practicing homeopathy with a vengeance. So, if you do or if you utilize this allopathic mind, materialistic mind, then you will definitely fail. You will not going to work out for the patient. But if you find it out exactly or measure the susceptibility, find it out exactly the mm, knowing what is the susceptibility and accordingly select potency and give it in infinite simul doses. The same material which you have used in infinite simul, then definitely it works. So there is a big difference in selection of the potency, and that depends upon judging the susceptibility. And then he says, such an error arises naturally from considering disease to the exhaustion exclusion of the patient. Look at the patient who is suffering from shock. He's pale, his features are sunken, his skin and muscles are relaxed, he is covered with cold, clammy sweat. His respiration is feeble, his pulse almost or quite extinct, he is perhaps almost or quite unconscious. Everything indicates that life and strength are at lowest ebb. The store of vital energy almost exhausted. The margin left to work upon is very narrow. There is but a step between him and death. The slightest false move, the least violence is likely to force him across the line which marks the boundary between life and death. It is if there is any condition which would seem to demand the use of mild and very mildest or most delicate means is this is one. Reaction as an expression of susceptibility in such cases is like to love of a fair woman, something to be wounded delicately, not brutally and fiercely as among barbarians. The condition of shock of or of extreme exhaustion is no occasion for heroic doses or strenuous measure, but rather for greatest gentleness and most refined doses. Let the patient inhale camphor or vinegar or ammonia very carefully if not only those domestic remedies are at hand, or give him 2 or 3 drop doses of brandy in a teaspoonful of water if that is at hand. Teaspoonful doses of hot black coffee may be useful, but as soon as possible, give our potentized arnica, arsenicum, naxomica, veratrum, or carbovage, and whatever other remedy may be indicated by the etiology and symptoms of the case. The results will be infinitely better than the results of strenuous method. So, see what he has mentioned. If such types of patients are there who are on the verge of death, generally looks to be on the in the stage of suspended animation, you have to bring those patients out. Stimulants are necessary, but how much quantity? Very minute quantity. So he has mentioned that that should be given just to bring him into the life. This has been mentioned by Hahnemann in the footnote to the paragraph 67, where he has mentioned the use of such antimethic measures or stimulants, and those only are necessary when such types of suspended animation states are there. But once the patient is out, then he says, again you have to take the totality and find it out exact homeopathic remedy, and that should be given in infinitesimal doses. So one must understand and judge how is the susceptibility. Once you understand exactly the susceptibility, then you can accordingly act and select proper remedy. And then he says, never said Dr. Wells, give brandy or any other stimulant with hard and wiry pulse. So there are many such things which we can find it out in such types of cases. We must judge the susceptibility and exactly utilize our weapons. If we don't have a remedy at that time, but such things are there, the coffee is there in our house, which can be used as a stimulant for time being for that case to bring out of that situation. It is whenever necessary. Those states are nothing but the suspended animation states. Very small part of the chapter is remaining. Tomorrow we'll continue and finish that chapter. And today evening we'll also finish the remaining part of the carbon group remedies, the physical aspects of carbon, then the certain common modalities of carbon group that we're going to discuss in the lecture in the 8:15 lecture. So be there. Thank you being there, and we'll meet again tomorrow.
Thank you very much, sir.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Thank you, sir. Have a good evening.
Good evening.